Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, the name that will echo through the corridors of history, came into the world on October 15, 1844, in the erstwhile Kingdom of Prussia's geographical division of Rücken, which lies near the town of Lützen. Fortunately for Friedrich Wilhelm, it was on this very day that Prussia's King Friedrich Wilhelm IV christened him. In the community church, Ludwig Nietzsche, a 31-year-old Lutheran pastor, was married to Friedrich's mother. Ludwig studied divinity at the Halle School and served as a governess to the three daughters of Joseph Saxe-Altenburg, a related war general and minor prince, for 7 years. Ludwig Euler first regarded her by chance in the year 1842, when he was 17 years of age and had just started working in Rücken. They exchanged vows in the October following Ludwig's 30th birthday. At the age of 19, Francesca, the niece of a Polish priest from Pobles, gave birth to Friedrich. A son, also named Ludwig Joseph, and a daughter, Elizabeth, were also welcomed by the pair in 1846. For Friedrich, his father, an amiable, active participant in the local community, was the primary reference during his early years. Young Friedrich, who grew up in a family of academics, took pleasure in the books elegantly arranged in his father's study. This ideal life would soon come to ruin due to the revolutions of 1848, which began that spring and summer across Europe. The Prussian revolutionists had such demands that even the King of Prussia was insulted by the necessity to concede. Nonetheless, more intimate troubles soon arose. Friedrich's father died in July of 1849 after bouts of strange seizures a few months prior. Friedrich's close sibling, Ludwig Joseph, also died shortly thereafter, in January of 1850. He was not even 2 weeks from his second birthday. Following the passing of his father and younger brother, Friedrich and his family moved to Naumburg, where his father's mother, Erdmuthe, and 2 aunts lived. The 5-year-old Friedrich, or Fritz, as he was affectionately called, found it a little hard to blend in with the city lifestyle of Naumburg. He started taking classes from a priest in training named Weber in 1851, and this was the same year he made 2 close friends, Wilhelm Pinder, who lived in one of the town's most esteemed houses, and Gustav Krug, Wilhelm's renowned cousin and the son of an eminent performer and public figure in the town. By October 1854, the already 10-year-old Fritz and his friends were enrolled at the cathedral for their high school upper grades. The Nietzsche family size increased within a couple of years. After buying a new piano, Fritz took some music lessons from the town's choir master to display his talents. Almost immediately after his 13th birthday, in October 1857, Friedrich began suffering from violent headaches. His mother withdrew him from school as he became ill. By the time he returned to school in early 1858, he had already written 2 one-act plays. In the latter part of that year, during the summer while staying with his mother's relatives in Poblis, he continued writing. In his works, he painted scenes from his early years, including sweet depictions of his father's home in Rücken. When Nietzsche was 13, he made already very elaborate comments on the church music he heard in the church his father had presided over. Defending the classical music tradition of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, he remarked, "This makes us think of nobler things." He referred to the contemporary Western Romantic composers such as Liszt and Berlioz as decadent, worthless art for the sake of art, accusing them of employing music for simple pleasure or sheer display of the art. Even though he devoted his whole adult life to the fight against moral prejudices, or rather his deeply offended sense of morals, already in his teenage years, he was demonstrating the literary gift that would later allow him to become one of the most significant writers, critics, and thinkers of all time. Within a few months of returning to Naumburg in September of 1858, Nietzsche was awarded a scholarship to the elite Forta boarding school, located west of Naumburg. This syllabus also included Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, all of which were part of the classical education provisions available in the 19th century. With respect to the school's timetable of 10 hours of work per day, Nietzsche quickly got used to it, and even enjoyed it, for he was able to go home quite often as Nuremberg was not far. He regretted being away from his friends Gustav and Wilhelm, who, however, remained in the town to continue their studies. There were astonishing events for Nietzsche in July 1859 during his summer break in the university town of Jena. He rejoined Forta towards the end of August and performed brilliantly in his examinations. However, this year was tainted by the sudden passing away of his maternal grandfather, David Wheeler, aged 72, resulting in the maternal members of his family being forced to move out of Poblaze. In the summer of 1860, Nietzsche, together with Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug, established a literary association entitled Germania and resolved to meet frequently to discuss their own and each other's writings. In that order of things, Nietzsche started writing a Christmas oratorio. That month, he received a 6-page letter from Krug in which the reviewer portrayed the 5-hour-long Tristan und Isolde, a Wagnerian opera based on the Arthurian cycle that had not yet been staged. Though its reviews were already sung and music scores existed and were in publication, Nietzsche was not particularly impressed by Wagner's output at this time. He continued to work on his oratorio, but was again plagued by migraines. In addition to that, he found himself attracted to Slavic and Hungarian folktales that year, and began showing an inclination towards the music of Liszt, whom he had earlier criticized as an immoral composer. What was more, this very year marked a significant turnaround in Nietzsche's view of literature and history. He wrote an excellent school essay in which he defended the poet and philosopher Friedrich Hölderlin, who had supported revolutionary ideas in France. He also debated the concept of German barbarism in light of the achievements of classical civilization. The influence of the English poet Lord Byron became evident in Nietzsche, with the character Manfred, a figure of romanticism, embedding itself within him. He went on to pen an even more controversial article, this time with the endorsement of Napoleon III, the French emperor and nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who, almost half a century ago, had conquered Germany. Both of Friedrich Nietzsche's friends took issue with his writing, which was one of the first signs that the man was not afraid to stir up controversy with his pen. In the years that followed, his creative output continued to expand as new processes of thinking emerged. Designating fate as this enslavement, Nietzsche believed that all customs and traditions adhered to by individuals from any age profoundly limited freedom. A free man, in the true sense of the term, according to Nietzsche, is always in conflict with these restrictions known as fate. He shared this within his essay, Fate and History. This intellectual thrust reached a climax when Nietzsche decided to embrace the fullness of life and abandon the moral values of Christianity, which both reared and constrained him. Nietzsche's studies at Forta had suffered regular interruptions due to persistent headaches and migraines. In the fall of 1862, he finally received Wagner's approval, deeply immersed in the Gothic drama, after acquiring the score from the Germania Society. The young Nietzsche even fearlessly attempted to play the piano with Krug intonating the much-rehearsed opera. Richly rewarded, even though Krug objected and insisted that it was Alyosha's notion to purchase it, Nietzsche was so excited that he carried the score to Forta. To explain the situation he found himself in, strict solitude was not achieved, and because of the strict regime, policemen supervised the Einsatzgruppen with companions to eat and drink. However, in the year 1863, a teacher caught him and a classmate after dismissing them from school due to intoxication, taking him back a term. He engaged in a lot of literary work, which in turn negatively influenced his grades, and he barely scraped through his final exams towards the end of summer in 1864. When he was at Bonn University, where he enrolled in theology against his growing antagonism towards religion, Nietzsche's friends Wilhelm Pinder and Gustav Krug were students of Heidelberg University. In October, he also went to Bonn, this time with Paul Deussen, a comrade from Forta who eventually became an eminent pundit in Sanskrit. He listened to lectures offered by Friedrich Nietzsche and Otto John, who were among the best in the field of philology when he was at Eisedel. In the 18th century, paleontological and ethnological philology reached the pinnacle of European scholarship, but in modern times, the subject seems to have lost its appeal. The process of textual and linguistic studies belongs to only one aspect of this practice, which historically is literary criticism. It is important to note that most of his earlier writings are undoubtedly of a philological nature, and even in those days, Nietzsche was viewed more as a philologist rather than how he is seen today, as a philosopher. He provoked considerable astonishment in his mother's mind when, while going to Naumburg during the Easter vacation in 1865, he replied that he had given up the ambitions of becoming a priest. As he developed an interest in philology, he also learned that there were many myths regarding creation. He subsequently understood that early Christians had also mythologized the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. Nietzsche claimed to ascribe no theological implications within the practice of philosophy, ignoring all familial pressures to return to theology. On one occasion, he was even seen carrying David Strauss's work of 1835, The Life of Jesus, which claimed the Gospels came from literal zealots several decades after Jesus' death. Upon his return to Bonn, he officially made the switch to the philology department. After a short time in Bonn, he returned to Saxony, where he attended the local University of Leipzig. Even though there were some financial constraints, he decided to go along with Friedrich Nietzsche, a recent recruit of Leipzig. At the age of 21, while still in his third year at Leipzig, he came across the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, which strongly resonated with him and influenced his philosophy. It was along this line that Smith, like Kant before him, presented a case in the world as will and representation that an uncognizable will, common to all living things, is the ontological reality, whereas the empirical world is but a representation born out of the sense organs, as Schopenhauer had suggested long before. The pessimistic conclusions drawn from this perspective, much like Darwin's reasons for the competition in existence, resonated with Nietzsche. Schopenhauer was known for writing about people with a certain pessimism, fully aware that intelligence and higher standing in nature only helped them reach a state of boring satisfaction after all their cravings were satisfied. The only remedy for the suffering endured by mankind, it seemed, was the enjoyment of nature and art. Early in 1866, Nietzsche's personal urge to usurp the world ideologically led him to form a philological society, where he read a paper that impressed Ritschl, who proposed he take steps to publish it. At that time, Saxony was caught up in the struggle between two powers, the southern German territory of the Austrian Habsburg Empire and the northern German region of Prussia. Following the commanding victory of the Prussians at the Battle of Königgrätz in July, as the Prussian Empire enlarged its territory, Saxony effectively became a mere territorial possession. In spite of his academic successes, German nationalistic sentiments reached Nietzsche, prompting him to join an artillery regiment in September 1867. However, a careless horseback riding accident caused him serious injuries in March of the following year. He used the subsequent recovery period to focus on his academic pursuits. He had written an award-winning essay about the 3rd century AD Greek historian and philosopher, Diogenes Laertius, prior to joining the army. As regards the most extensive treatment of the lives of virtually all the great philosophers of the ancient world, including Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoic school, it is Laertius who remains one of the most authoritative sources. Upon release, 2 more of Ritschl's illustrious periodicals that were issued later in 1868 adopted for publication Nietzsche's paper, which was devoted to Laertius. It was during his time in the military that Nietzsche found himself at the age of 24, returning to Leipzig in October 1868, already on the path to prominence as a learned academist. On the 8th of November, after a mutual friend introduced them to one another, Nietzsche received an invitation to attend a clandestine session featuring Richard Wagner, a great fascination of his. Wagner captivated the small group of listeners with pieces from his operas before the conversation shifted to philosophical issues. It delighted Nietzsche to discover that the composer he admired most was also an ardent admirer of Schopenhauer. Following this meeting, Wagner extended an invitation to Nietzsche to continue their conversation at his residence in Lucerne, Switzerland. Strangely enough, soon after that, an offer came from the University of Basel in Switzerland, enabling Nietzsche to take up a post as a professor of ancient philology. Carrying the burden of a mere 3,000 Swiss franc annual remuneration, Nietzsche, in search of greener pastures and in need of mental rehabilitation, left in March 1869 for the mountains of Appenzell to assume the position with the North Basel Alps, despite not having completed the final year of his undergraduate program. It is evident from his earlier writings that this new school of thought in Basel convinced the authorities to employ the young man, even without a degree. Although the dislocation from friends and family in Germany caused discomfort to Nietzsche, he often made trips to Wagner's estate in Tribschen, located at the shores of Lake Lucerne, after his arrival in Switzerland. During one such visit, he formed a warm friendship with the daughter of Franz Liszt and Wagner's mistress, and later wife, Cosima. Nietzsche would later glorify her as the most divine woman. With Wagner busy composing other sections of the Ringwork, particularly Siegfried, which focused on the Germanic myths that had long fascinated Nietzsche, he was more than pleased to be inducted into his idol's inner circle, much to the young philologist's enjoyment, and the great composer's as well. 2 weeks after spending Christmas with the Wagner family, Nietzsche, in what he would later call the Winter of Discontent, delivered 2 controversial lectures in February 1870. In these lectures, delivered to an audience of Western philosophers, he blamed Socrates, in part, for the degeneration of Greek civilization from its high form of epic poetry and tragedy. Nietzsche would go on to contest and elaborate on this idea, positing that classical Greece was at its peak in the 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, and that the late 5th century BCE marked a decline, including Socrates and other thinkers whom Nietzsche regarded as shallow in their philosophizing. Nonetheless, the pleasure for Nietzsche was short-lived. He quickly realized that the permanent position at Basel, made official in April 1870, would entail 20 hours a week of teaching with very little time for his own research and writing. A few weeks later, disappointment struck many of Wagner's devotees when he informed them that he intended to leave Tribschen and operate his own opera house in Bayreuth, Bavaria, with the help of King Ludwig II, who was also his lover. There, he hoped to showcase his ring cycle with his specially trained musicians. Distressed, Nietzsche wrote to Cosima, saying that within a year or two, he hoped to go to Bayreuth and leave the academy. In July 1870, French Emperor Napoleon III declared war against Prussia, adding more chaos to Nietzsche's already indescribable life. He spent his summer vacation with the Wagners before being granted leave from the university to serve as a medical orderly in eastern France. He joined the Prussian Southern Army headquarters located at Nancy, in Lorraine, just before the Prussians dealt a humiliating defeat to the French army at Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870. In the few short months that the Franco-Prussian War lasted, Nietzsche's opinions about it underwent a transformation. The war was short-lived, perfectly schemed by Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor who orchestrated its execution in January 1871 to enable the establishment of the German Empire, with Prussia at the center. The issue stemmed in part from the fact that while doing his work as a hospital orderly, Nietzsche developed both dysentery and diphtheria, which worsened his already frail health. By the end of the war, he held a sour view of the Prussians' so-called advance. While ill during the winter of 1870, he began contemplating a shift in focus from the science of language to the science of ideas. After a very pleasant Christmas break, getting treated to see Wagner present his Siegfried idyll for Cosima as a birthday gift, things soon turned sour. Nietzsche was unhappy to travel back to Basel on his own after some of his friends refused to accompany him, and there was more disappointment to come. The application Nietzsche made for the chair of professorship in philosophy at the university was not successful. During his convalescence in the Italian town of Lugano, Nietzsche began studying Greek tragedy. The outcome of this study was the birth of his work, The Birth of Tragedy, in the late year of 1871. He perceived a dichotomous struggle between Apollonian and Dionysian principles in Greek tragedy, one representing chaos and sentiment, the other precision and intellect. These energies were embodied in the cults of Dionysius, the god of excess, drunkenness, pleasure, and insanity, and Apollo, the deity of music and dance. It is widely believed that the Dionysian idea is best expressed in music, and it's possible that sound itself played a role in creating the epic poems of ancient Greece. In the preface to The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche also mentioned Wagner, who, in his view, distinguished himself from other composers by attaining the happiness of the Greeks, which was both Apollonian and Dionysian. The musician delighted so much in Nietzsche's work that he even encouraged him to send it to his father-in-law, Franz Liszt, and Bavaria's King Ludwig. This admiration for Nietzsche by musicians and painters stood in stark contrast to the reception in academic circles, where his work was widely criticized. Among the detractors was Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who had mentored Nietzsche, much to his disappointment. Yet, The Birth of Tragedy presents an invigorating appeal regarding the appreciation of classical Greek values, an appeal that resonates even with readers today. By the turn of the 1870s, Nietzsche had already begun to carve out his own path, steering his readings and ideas in new directions. To Nietzsche, Wagner's, and his own rank in Germany, a Germany whose culture was on the verge of great heights similar to those of Goethe's, Beethoven's, Mozart's, and Kant's wondrous century, could be regarded as the last Renaissance propagators. This belief was expressed in several public speeches Nietzsche made in the early months of 1872, where he attacked the German school system and warned against the rising tide of indifference towards education's containment within noble classes. He argued that, while training state officials, farmers, and factory workers was necessary, placing too much emphasis on functionalism denigrated intellectualism and the appreciation of arts and culture. He believed that people should prepare for their careers, yes, but they should also pursue study for the sake of mastering the purely theoretical aspects of work. In May, Nietzsche traveled all the way to Bayreuth to attend the ceremony marking the laying of the foundation stone for Wagner's new theater, a structure built according to the composer's plans. Back in Basel, however, Nietzsche soon found himself wrapped up in a furious debate in the newspapers on the value of his book, The Birth of Tragedy, which had just been published. He might have liked the attention he received, but he understood that most of the philologists opposed him. He spent the summers in Italy, only to return to Basel and find that only 2 students had signed up for his course on Greek and Roman rhetoric, a course he was still expected to teach. This same situation forced him to cancel his second lecture on Homer. However, in terms of research on the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, Nietzsche resolved to work without haste, with the aim of publishing it for a special occasion, Wagner's 60th birthday, celebrated in May 1873. The title of the work would be Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. When Nietzsche arrived in Bayreuth in early April for a social visit to the Wagners and to oversee the theater's construction, the Wagners were not particularly enthusiastic about the reading of his latest unpublished work. Nietzsche tried to ease the tension by introducing a piece of his own music, which he played on the piano, but was met with equally awkward stares instead. In early May, David Strauss's faith debate, The Old and the New, was being published, even as Nietzsche neared the completion of his own new book. The work, Life of Jesus, by David Strauss, had been responsible for Nietzsche's loss of belief in God. And now, 40 years after the original publication of some of the most controversial writings in history, The Life of Jesus, Strauss's latest book offered a radical Christian outlook, one which accepted the Schopenhauerian view of why humanity is in such a miserable state, due to a decaying brain. That incensed nihilism, centuries in the making, incised the sacred and indestructible image of Strauss. Such was the modern German cultural barbarism that had completely misplaced beauty and truth, and settled for comfort and ease. This was the first of 4 writings that Nietzsche later compiled. which he titled Untimely Meditations, published in 1876. The first of his essays on Strauss appeared in these writings, which Nietzsche edited and published under the title Untimely Meditations. In the next part of the work, he placed another negative emphasis, this time on the worship of heroes and the creation of myths, in the section entitled On the Use and Abuse of History for Life. Still, he respected these studies, as they served the purpose of reminding everyone that people were once capable of achieving such heights. All the while, he suggested studying the past only every now and then, with an emphasis on the future. After that, Nietzsche turned to denying the importance of past events, arguing that such historical views were illegitimate in Germany, in his view. Another essay he wrote at that time was titled Schopenhauer as Educator, in which he commended Schopenhauer for attempting to free readers from the bondage of orthodoxy. This, of course, influenced Nietzsche. His views were purely independent. The arts offered the subject for the fourth untimely meditation, titled Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. Nietzsche managed to finish most of it by early 1875, but eventually became almost blind due to illness. For over a century, scholars have debated Nietzsche's health. Many have suggested that he suffered from tertiary syphilis, but he likely suffered from a host of other afflictions that gradually accumulated, including failing eyesight, frequent stomach cramps, chronic migraines, seizures, blackouts, and even hemorrhoids. Such a number of neurological issues led to various theories, including one that claims Nietzsche developed a brain tumor. His recent illness prevented him from making a full recovery until he completed the manuscript in Bayreuth with the assistance of a young musician and admirer, Heinrich Koselleck, in July 1876. He immediately sent out copies and urged Nietzsche to go to Bayreuth in haste to attend the last rehearsals before the premiere of the Ring Cycle, which was set for the middle of August. There were already many members of the aristocracy in the town of Bayreuth by the time of Nietzsche's arrival on July 22nd, most of whom were there not to appreciate Wagner's work, but simply to attend the social functions. To avoid the crowd, Nietzsche declined the opportunity to meet the King of Bavaria. The University of Basel also granted Nietzsche a one-year break from his work. He spent most of it in Italy with Malwida von Meisenberg, a German noblewoman who had left her family and associated with several prominent revolutionists in Europe. Malwida greatly admired the works of both Nietzsche and Wagner. Although they differed in age by almost 3 decades, Meisenberg became one of Nietzsche's closest friends after their first meeting in Munich a few years before. Nietzsche was accompanied on his trip to Sorrento on the Bay of Naples by 2 men, Albert Brenner and Dr. Paul Rée, both former students of his. The influence of Rée on Nietzsche made him even question Schopenhauer's most bleak writings. At this time, Nietzsche also found himself in a quarrel with Wagner, as he began to harbor more and more criticism for Wagner's Germanness. In addition to philosophical disagreements, Wagner understood that due to Nietzsche's poor health, his hope of having Nietzsche edit a publication promoting Wagner's ideas on music and the arts would remain unfulfilled. Upon returning to Basel in the autumn of 1877, Nietzsche went for an appointment with Dr. Otto Iser in Frankfurt. The doctor attributed his failing eyesight to a torn optic nerve and sternly recommended that Nietzsche forego reading and writing for a decade. This, however, was not a course of action Nietzsche was ever going to take. During his time off, Nietzsche was composing a 5th untimely meditation on the state of humanity, but by the time he completed the work, it had transformed into a new book nearly 300 pages in length entitled Human, All Too Human. This work saw the light of day in the spring of 1878. Using a collection of 638 aphorisms, Nietzsche asserted almost systematically that there are no eternal truths, and that both Kant and Schopenhauer were very much wrong in trying to find them. Nietzsche made a dramatic about-turn in respect to his previous convictions. He prioritized science over art, claiming that any small scientific breakthrough was already an invaluable contribution to human progress. While still retaining a positive outlook on art, Nietzsche bluntly explained that art served as a means to traverse the worlds of over-religiosity, rationality, and his bohemian thinking. His book was in fact titled A Book for Free Spirits. In other parts of the book, Nietzsche persisted in his unrelenting criticism of Christianity, asserting that its core concepts were fabricated social constructs that had no relevance to modern times, and that these principles lacked any rational or scientific basis. The new book so infuriated Wagner, to whom Nietzsche considered sending it, that he ultimately decided against it. In time, Nietzsche came to admire the heartfelt attention of Schmeitzner, both his and Wagner's publisher, who informed him that Wagner had been in possession of the book, but after reading only a small portion, had put it away to preserve his positive image of Nietzsche's early works. After reading the book, many of Nietzsche's acquaintances offered similar evaluations, being especially affronted by what they saw as his idealistic insincerity regarding ethical practices. Nietzsche countered these accusations by providing a second part to the work, subtitled Mixed Opinions and Maxims, containing another 400 or so aphorisms, in which he asserted that Christianity was a cult of suffering, and that the self-abasing and self-denying aspects of Christians were actually a selfish wish to be saved from hell. In May 1879, due to his worsening condition, Nietzsche tendered a letter requesting an exemption from his position at the University of Basel. His mental state and view of life had evolved greatly during his stay in Basel. However, he would have to fight for survival as an unaffiliated thinker for the next 10 years, while drawing a university pension of 3,000 Swiss francs per annum with occasional assistance from relatives and friends. Yet, Nietzsche was about to enter the most creative phase of his life, despite being in precarious health and the judgment he received regarding his work in the 1870s. Being freed from his teaching obligations provided him with an opportunity for creative writing and research on an unprecedented scale, even before. He had also compiled The Wanderer and His Shadow, one more book of pregnant sayings, by the autumn of 1879. Nietzsche believed that the concern of metaphysics was not fit for human beings, and therefore reproached the promotion of such ideas as the salvation of the soul. He contested Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous assertion that man is born free and everywhere in chains, asserting that, in fact, human societies arose as a defensive measure against external hazards, and that the earliest instances of justice were just systems of revenge that had been legitimized. This brings us back to the ageless issue of what man is like in the state of nature. Entitled The Wanderer and His Shadow, Nietzsche referred to his aphorisms in both positive and negative aspects on the same subject. For instance, Nietzsche spoke about war, claiming that it is a great force that achieves its goals at a decisive cost to the community, but may also serve as the much-needed impetus to revive a population that has been dormant for ages, and to internalize conflicts that are otherwise persistent among the people. The inclusion of cultural anthropology and the research of primitive peoples and their social institutions all incorporate the notions from the treatise The Wanderer and His Shadow. However, these views often led to fierce debates. In the winter of 1879, Nietzsche's health worsened, and during the rest of 1880, he was constantly on the move in search of a more temperate climate. He went to the area of the northern Italian lakes in February 1880, where he managed to meet Heinrich Koselleck, whom he later traveled with to Venice. Thus, Nietzsche enjoyed his stay in Venice with a young companion who played a great role in converting his then illegible manuscripts into clean, fair copies. Nevertheless, the summer heat came to an end for Nietzsche at the luxurious spa town of Marienbad in what is now the Czech Republic. He arrived in Genoa after landing at Frankfurt Airport in September and purposely left for Italy in late October, as he did not want to be around when winter set in. Also in this vein, Nietzsche was literally ahead of schedule, as he completed the rough draft of the book titled Morgenröte, or Morning Glow, by February 1881, and saw its publication in June. Nietzsche had great expectations for the book, but it turned out to be one of his more obscure writings. Still, it enabled him to pay tribute to Oriental beliefs, especially Buddhism, which shunned gods and promoted the fulfillment of the self spiritually. It provided him with a platform to advance his ideas about Christianity's adverse effects on human evolution. In January of 1882, Nietzsche was physically well, so he welcomed the company of Paul Rée, who even went further by bringing a typewriter to help Nietzsche with his activities. Just like everyone else, Nietzsche tried using a typewriter for the first time, and at first he struggled, almost straining his eyes just to press the right keys without making mistakes. Typewriters had only been on the market since the late 1860s. Now that he was almost in his late 30s, Nietzsche lightly suggested that perhaps it was time to get married, a subject he occasionally broached with Paul Rée and Malwida von Meisenbug during their stay in Sorrento. After spending 5 weeks with Nietzsche in Genoa, Rée went to Rome to join Meisenbug. In the salon of Meisenbug, Rée met Lo Salome, a 21-year-old Russian-born poet whose radical ideas during her college days caused her to turn away from the gods, the church, and the moral maps taught to students of theology. This brilliant woman was recommended to Nietzsche by Rée. Nietzsche's visit to Rome began in the middle of April after a sojourn in Messina, Sicily. Despite the awkwardness of their first meetings in the Italian capital, Salome's wit soon dazzled even Nietzsche. Sometimes Nietzsche thought he had found a young female apprentice in Salome who could assist him in his work. In contrast to Rée, who lovingly bombarded her with romantic letters, Nietzsche insisted that he was not at all romantically interested in Salome, claiming that she only wanted to be a friend, a condition that Salome herself later breached, proving that she was actually engaged to Nietzsche when they last met in Lucerne in early May. Salome made an arrangement, and the three were to exist in a commune of philosophy in Vienna. Friends who were highly skeptical warned Nietzsche not to get involved with Salome. They quickly reminded him that he had no sexual interest towards her, but rather wanted to groom her into being his protégé. In July, he invited her and his sister, Elizabeth, to accompany him to a performance of Wagner's Parsifal in Bayreuth. The performance, which Salome was to play in, was hated by Nietzsche because of its overt religious themes and the story of the knight Percival's quest for the Holy Grail. Externally cordial, Elizabeth and Salome were yet enemies. The Russian girl was obnoxious to Nietzsche. During this time, though, Nietzsche was putting the finishing touches on his writing of Joyous Science, wherein he endorsed the biological theories of evolution espoused by Charles Darwin, a subject still very controversial more than 20 years after the publication of the latter's book, The Origin of Species. He altered what he had been arguing in Birth of Tragedy and put that particular fight up as well. Moreover, Nietzsche also viciously criticized the Darwinian doctrine of the survival of the fittest, reasoning that viruses and other creatures were created simply to survive. Nietzsche recognized that a considerable number of people who contributed greatly toward the culture of man, such as the Renaissance artistic works of Raphael and composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, had died young and had no descendants. In Nietzsche's philosophy, the life of man has two opposite aspects: the tragic one, which follows from the understanding of man as a mere speck in the vast cosmos, and the comic one, to which arrogant, transitory beings who thought they could control all things in nature are what people are like. In the final chapter of this book, Nietzsche invites his readers to provoke a war of ideas between religion and science. In many ways, the science of Joyful Science was a speculation, an experiment with the cultural evolution model, which engaged and tried to incorporate Darwin's biological evolution. Notably, despite the title of his book being Joyful Science, Nietzsche was of the opinion that the dark elements of human life would invariably trump the positive aspects. Engaging with Salome, however, made him more optimistic about life. The philosopher called 3 weeks of August 1882, spent in Teutoburg, Saxony, engaging in philosophical discussions, one of the best times of my life. Nevertheless, this did not sit well with Nietzsche's mother and sister, who were pulling him away from Salome, prompting him to move from Nuremberg to Leipzig. There, the already fragile connections of the triangle, binding the young Russian to Nietzsche, and the jealous Ray, who disapproved of his alone time with Salome, began to fray as Salome would not bow to Nietzsche's intellectual supremacy. Also, during this period, it was later recognized in private notes that there was a biological side to Nietzsche's craving for Salome. During the ensuing weeks, when their relationship began to disintegrate, Nietzsche was subjected to considerable agony. Promising true closure remained unreachable. Nietzsche retreated deeper into despair, wasting more opium than he could bear in hopes of quieting his spiraling anguish, all while remaining content to exchange barbs with the very colleagues who were trying to cut him off in Rapallo, Italy, many months later. Even if it is difficult to imagine Nietzsche dealing with the breakup rationally, it was also the period of his most creative work, because he began to shape what is generally seen as his very best work. Thus spoke Zarathustra. In doing this, he sought to build a new philosophy to which the ideas of Schopenhauer, Kant, or any other intellectual nemesis would not provide influence. Zoroastrianism, the earliest known religion to attest to the concept of one God, had its beginnings in the first millennium BC in the regions of Mesopotamia and Persia, where people believed in the presence of a supreme God, Ahura Mazda, who was at all times in conflict with the evil spirit Ahriman. It is worth noting that the first prophet who preached this philosophy was Zoroaster from Persia. Nietzsche did not appreciate Zoroastrianism's conception of good and evil, which can be said to have played a key role in the development of Christianity. For that reason, he decided to project certain ideas of his philosophy through the figure of the Persian prophet Zoroaster, in whom he saw a rebel against the existing order. The initial half of Zarathustra was composed by Nietzsche in 10 days, at the end of January 1883. In weeks, he learned that another great man had died unexpectedly in Venice, this time Richard Wagner. After a heated argument that took place in the mid-1870s, they had not seen one another for more than 6 years, although Nietzsche had always been fond of certain parts of the great composer's work. In the course of her trip to Rome in April 1883, Nietzsche came to terms with his sister, Elizabeth, who had blamed him for all his failures with Salome before. The third part of Zarathustra, written by Nietzsche in Nice and finished in the early months of 1884, is about Zoroaster's return to the mountain. There he resigns to a very unfortunate, predefined understanding of time and life, which he assumes to be cyclic, that nothing will ever develop, and that all changes made will eventually revert and repeat. Still, Zarathustra, the Zoroaster Nietzsche finds, comes to terms with the concept of time beyond limits. Notwithstanding, where Nietzsche intended to finish with the last part of his trilogy on Zarathustra in January 1885, he in fact created 20 more scenes, the contents of which were such a blasphemy that the author confined the 4th chapter, which he printed to 40 copies only and gave out to a few acquaintances. The Leipzig-based printer, Konstantin Naumann, who had already printed the first 3 volumes upon Schmeitzner's request, was also the one who made these special copies. By this time, Nietzsche had also distanced himself from Schmeitzner. In the meantime, Nietzsche had learned that his sister, Elisabeth, was set to marry a prolific Wagnerite, Dr. Bernhard Förster. This educator lost his teaching posts owing to his teaching of extremist ideologies, and he planned on establishing a German nationalist movement in South America. Anticipating resistance from Nietzsche and their mother, the two nevertheless got married in May and prepared to leave for Paraguay early in 1886. Out of these possibilities, Nietzsche instead opted to abandon the style of ancient religious sages that had previously shaped his voice. After completing Zarathustra, he resolved to write more conventional philosophical books. He finished writing Beyond Good and Evil by March of 1886. He hadn't really succeeded in finding any willing publishing house, so he reverted to printing the first edition of the book all by himself. Several reasons led to this. Hundreds of copies of his works had not been favorably received by publishers. Zarathustra, along with Nietzsche's other works, which included Book 4 of the next book, were never published. Instead, they had already been set aside. Because of the expected losses, publishers were afraid to publish any of those books. The music publishing house of Ernst Wilhelm Friedrich would later purchase the remaining stock of his previous titles. Despite the lack of sales, Nietzsche purchased 250 copies of Beyond Good and Evil because he considered it a clear presentation of his views. This latest work was another onslaught against the tides of nivellation and equalization that Nietzsche perceived as insidiously spread by Christianity. Nietzsche was against these changes, believing that aristocratic cultures had advanced a great deal, both technologically and artistically. He analyzed two different moralities, the master and slave moralities, and recognized morality as a social construct created and imposed upon human beings living in communities. Despite Nietzsche's optimistic assessment of the book's potential, it is still surprising to note that in February 1887, only 65 copies of Beyond Good and Evil were sold. The only reader who appreciated the book's content was Meta von Salis, a writer and the first female PhD in Switzerland. The familiarity between Salis and Nietzsche dates back to their first meeting in 1884. They were not just acquaintances, but very good friends. Years later, in 1887, in Sils Maria, when Salis visited Nietzsche, he resumed his work on the follow-up to Beyond Good and Evil, titled On the Genealogy of Morality, mainly because the earlier book was not performing well in sales. Reflecting on his philological studies, he noted that the term good in several cultures was derived from roots signifying valiance and nobility, implying that those deemed bad were the lowly. Nietzsche accepted that this was the beginning of the age of word inflection. In the regions of the Levant and other parts of the Middle East, where civilizations first developed, the early historic times were dominated by a priestly class. In this context, honor and faith were considered superior virtues to valor and nobility. Questioning this system, the case of Jesus Christ emerged, urging people to care for the weak, to find peace within themselves. According to Nietzsche, following the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Germanic and Scandinavian invaders acted as a buffer against the spread of Christian imperialism. Even after converting to Christianity, the new rulers maintained a hierarchical society that borrowed from the structures of the Roman state. However, in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution reinstated the slave morality as practiced in Calvinist Geneva. More people may struggle with his views on morality, but On the Genealogy of Morality ranks among the most prominent works of Nietzsche. This is due to the extent of the research he had undertaken, which spanned 3,000 years in the development of morality, especially that of Judaism and Christianity. While he was engaged in writing these philosophical treatises, he was also periodically affected by illness. Nevertheless, he was in better health within a couple of years when he visited Nice at the start of 1888, and it was during this time that he conceived the idea for a 4-volume work about his philosophy, which he entitled The Will to Power. In March of that year, however, he abandoned the idea because it proved to be too overreaching. At that time, he was already planning a trip to Turin for another refuge. Enjoying the cultural ambiance and the melodic allure of the city, Nietzsche lingered for 3 months before departing for Sils Maria in Switzerland. In a moment of creativity, Nietzsche hermetically wrote The Case of Wagner, a controversial book that accused his earlier idol, Wagner, of embodying the decadence of European culture and arts, especially in music. He continued with The Twilight of the Idols, a satirical critique of all philosophical and religious doctrines that he considered unworthy. The title of this work was intended as a parody of Wagner's last opera of the Ring Cycle, The Twilight of the Gods. Subsequently, the author published The Antichrist, in which he provided an analysis of the origins of Christianity. Nietzsche stated that early Christians preached a religion of judgment, threatening people with heaven and hell as rewards or punishments. In contrast, Jesus, who preached, "The kingdom is at hand," had asked his disciples to be free of hate and resentment, as the kingdom existed through them in the present. After arriving in Turin at the beginning of September, Nietzsche asserted that Buddhism was strikingly similar to the teachings of the Christian Jesus, except that while Buddhism makes no promises and anyway keeps them, Christianity offers all and delivers nothing. To celebrate his 44th birthday on October 15, 1888, he wrote a self-serving essay called Ecce Homo, or Such a Man, which are the words of Pontius Pilate, as he presented Jesus to the Jews. Nietzsche sought to correct the misconceptions that had formed about his previous book in this brief work, under provocative titles such as What Makes Me So Clever and What Gives Me the Nerves to Write Such Smart Books. Nietzsche scrutinized his background, his illness, as well as admired and not so admired thinkers and creative people in history. In the course of defending his own writing, he injected the text with distortions of the truth, presenting his Zarathustra as the best creation ever written, far surpassing Goethe, Shakespeare, or Dante. Also, one should bear in mind that Nietzsche was being playful throughout Ecce Homo, both in the chapter titles, which were most likely meant to poke fun at his critics, and in the haughty parts that displayed his literary prowess. After composing Ecce Homo in a brief span of only 3 weeks, he returned to the unresolved grievance with Wagner from a few years before, which still tormented him. History repeated itself, and bringing examples from his previous texts, he declared that it was not he who altered his position on German culture, but Wagner, who changed in the late 1870s due to more nationalistic tendencies and public pressure. The decade of creativity Nietzsche enjoyed and exploited in the 1880s was entering its final lap. Towards the end of this year, he experienced an unusual regression in his mental state. He had frequent avulsions and even composed letter of insensate adulation to Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm II, among others, for their political activities, and he corresponded with friends engaged in conversations about forming an anti-German alliance and defeating Germany. He wrote that God is on earth, and in a letter to Meta von Salis, dated 3 January 1889, asserted that he had shot Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm II and had incarcerated the Pope. An account published later suggests that Nietzsche's condition became manifest following the incident when he saw a horse being beaten by its rider on the streets of Turin and ran forth to rescue it, collapsing down at its feet. It is clear and undisputable that he was gravely sick. Specialists who suggest that he was suffering from cancers of the brain or serious late-stage syphilis agree that during 1888 and 1889 he deteriorated over a period of time. As news about his odd demeanor became widespread, Nietzsche's family was in great hurry to take him back to Switzerland. In reference to the suggested treatment of the philosophers Solers in respect to the possible early onset of syphilis, it is acknowledged that his mother Franziska was in charge of him in Naumburg. For a year or two maybe, however, Nietzsche was able to talk coherently. He, however, deteriorated in days and got sick beyond help. Even as the fate of Nietzsche's final and unpublished works remained in limbo until 1892, when Elizabeth allowed Naumann to issue a second version of her brother's works, which was edited by Heinrich Koselitz, who bore the alias Peter Gast, a name Nietzsche had used to christen him for his musical works. The failed Guatemala incursion that Elizabeth undertook was over, and her spouse was driven to suicide by the hopelessness following the calamity. In the year of the mission, she seized control of the situation. She fired Koselitz, who had been writing the biography of her brother, and filled in the resulting gap herself, continuing the vicious war against Lau Salome, and even blaming the latter for her brother's mental collapse. After the conflict with her mother regarding the publication of The Antichrist, Elizabeth resolved to acquire her mother's future earnings in 1895. After the demise of Franziska in 1895, April 1897, Elizabeth moved her brother to the Villa Silberblick near Weimar, where she entertained admirers of Nietzsche's work and even brought them to see him regardless of his poor health. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche passed away from a heart attack at Villa Silberblick on August 25, 1900, shortly before reaching the age of 56. 3 days later, the vicar's objections did not hinder him from being buried beside his father in the Roken parish church. Following a chaotic existence that spanned a career fighting a persistent illness, to be known as an ardent anti-Christian, who sought to erase the notions of morality, and even succeeding as an individual, the last place where the common bastion of such views was a grave in a Christian cemetery. It is worth noting that Nietzsche claimed that, after his end, Jesus' followers made a great deal of mess of the very teaching he delivered. At the same time, fascists, communism, and imperialism dates back before, irrespective of communism bearing Nietzsche. These Josephites twisted the concepts of the will to prove, Lord Compass, and Ubermensch. Most vocal had been Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who openly advocated anti-Semitism and Germancyman in connection to her brother. Time and again before her death in 1935 at the age of 88, she allegedly met with Adolf Hitler. From 1930 to the early part of 1945, the Nazis also appropriated the philosophy of Nietzsche and Wagner for their ends. Very few, if any, other philosophers have found themselves at the center of as many controversies as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He has also been justifiably regarded as one of the most incredibly creative minds of the modern period. Whatever opinion one may hold concerning the final outcome that he arrived at, it cannot be disputed that the ideas that he put forth in such books as The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and in articles such as those included in Untimely Meditations, were exceptional in terms of their form and method. Alas, for many, his disdain for social egalitarianism and his outright rejection of the Western traditions of morality may not be pleasant. In yet another element of this unifying structure, it is not quite right to say that he held fascist views. Another example might be that he was neither a demagogue nor a dictator, nor any radicalism. The intensity of his thought is acknowledged by all, and even those who disagree with him do not ignore it. Previous theorists have discussed the inevitable rise of secularization, which many thinkers have termed the death of God, and how this will ineluctably lead to the fall of Christianity in Europe, congregating churches in the 20th century, and provided a justification for vast swathes of existentialism in the aftermath of World War II too. A lot of assertions made by Nietzsche regarding sociology, anthropology, and history, to a more or less the same extent, have also considered the progress of society. Probably the most noticeable thing about Nietzsche might be the volume of his writings. Its bewildering array of both conceptual and practical components borders on philological embarrassment itself, including history, anthropology, and philology, religion, creative literature, music theory, among many other things. Not to mention, oh my God, philosophy. For better or for worse, one's opinion about him notwithstanding, contemporary scholarship cannot ignore or avoid Nietzsche. What's your take on Friedrich Nietzsche? Was he a profound and creative individual who drove people to make progress and attain different heights of intelligence and culture? Or was his convoluted philosophy simply a product of a sick mind, which was eating itself away in many ways in the 1880s? We appreciate your watching and would like to invite your comments below.